Eric's world shatters when he discovers his wife Claire's secret affair with Jake, a manipulative con artist. What begins as heartbreak quickly spirals into chaos as Eric faces betrayal, lies, and escalating threats from Jake, who refuses to back down. As tensions rise, Eric is forced to fight for his business, his safety, and his sanity, all while navigating Claire's pleas for forgiveness and Jake's relentless pursuit of revenge. Fueled by anger and desperation, Eric's journey exposes the devastating consequences of infidelity and deceit, leaving viewers questioning trust, loyalty, and justice in relationships. Welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. We're so glad you're here. Seriously, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's jump into today's story, because it's a wild one. Eric Dawson wiped his hands on an old towel, the scent of oil and metal clinging to his skin as he locked up his garage for the night. It was 8:30 p.m., later than usual, but the custom engine job he'd been working on couldn't wait. He stepped outside, the cool night air hitting his face, and let out a long breath. Home was only 10 minutes away, but tonight, the drive felt longer. It wasn't just exhaustion. Lately, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When he pulled into the driveway of his 2-story suburban home, the lights were still on. That was strange. Claire usually turned them off before bed. "Hey babe, I'm home," he called out, stepping inside. Claire's voice floated down the stairs. "I'm up here just finishing some lesson plans." Claire taught English at the local high school. She was the organized one. The planner. Eric admired that about her, even if her obsession with sticky notes and color-coded calendars drove him crazy sometimes. As he climbed the stairs, he glanced at the framed wedding photo hanging in the hallway. 4 years ago, they'd stood in front of family and friends, promising forever. Eric still remembered how nervous he'd been, how Claire's smile had steadied him. But lately, forever felt like it was slipping away. "Long day?" Claire asked as he stepped into their bedroom. She was sitting at her desk, papers spread out in neat stacks. "You could say that." He walked over and kissed her cheek. Her hair smelled like vanilla, but she didn't lean into him the way she used to. Eric sat on the edge of the bed, unlacing his boots. "You're up late again." "Finals are coming. My students need extra feedback." She kept her eyes on the papers in front of her, flipping through them a little too quickly. "Did you eat dinner?" "I grabbed something earlier. You?" "Yeah." He didn't mention that it had been a microwave burrito. The conversation stalled, and the silence between them felt heavier than it should have. Eric glanced at her phone sitting face down on the desk. He'd never been the jealous type, but lately, Claire had been glued to that thing. He told himself it was nothing, that he was just overthinking. But then Claire stood up, stretching. "I'm going to shower and head to bed. Don't wait up." And just like that, he was alone again. The next morning started like any other. Eric was back at the garage by 7 a.m., tuning carburetors and replacing brake pads. He loved his work. There was something satisfying about fixing things. By noon, he was elbow-deep in grease when his coworker Mike walked in. "You good, man?" Mike asked, tossing him a rag. "Yeah, just tired." "You sure? 'Cause you've been looking like hell all week." Eric forced a laugh. "Thanks for that." "Hey, I'm serious. Is it Claire?" Eric stiffened. "What about Claire?" Mike hesitated. "Look, it's probably nothing, but I saw her downtown yesterday. She was having lunch with some guy." Eric's stomach dropped. "What guy?" "I don't know, suit, fancy watch, didn't look like a coworker though." Eric tried to brush it off. Claire had friends, male coworkers even. It didn't mean anything, but the doubt had already taken root. That night he decided to ask. "Claire, who were you with yesterday?" he asked over dinner. She blinked. "What?" "Downtown Mike said he saw you having lunch with some guy." Claire's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "You had Mike spying on me?" "No, he just mentioned it. I was curious." Claire set her fork down and crossed her arms. "It was Jake. Remember him from college. He's helping me plan the senior trip." "Jake?" "Yes, Jake. We ran into each other a few weeks ago and he offered to help. It's nothing." Eric wanted to believe her. He really did. but the way she avoided his eyes told him there was more to the story. The days blurred together, after that Claire's late nights at school turned into weekend meetings. Her phone was always locked, and when Eric asked about it, she got defensive. "You don't trust me, do you?" she snapped one night. "It's not that." "Then what?" Eric didn't have an answer. 2 weeks later, he found it. Claire had left her phone on the counter while she was in the shower. Eric knew it was wrong, but something made him pick it up. The messages were there. Dozens of them. "Jake, can't stop thinking about last night." Claire, "Me too. I wish we had more time." Jake, "Soon he won't suspect a thing." Eric's hands shook as he scrolled. The words blurred together, but the meaning was clear. Claire was having an affair. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the phone. His world tilted, the foundation of everything he thought he knew crumbling beneath him. He heard the shower shut off and panic set in. He put the phone back exactly where he'd found it and walked out the front door. Outside, the night air hit him like a slap. He leaned against his truck, trying to breathe. This couldn't be happening. But it was. Claire, the woman he'd built a life with, the woman he'd loved more than anything, had betrayed him. And now, Eric had to figure out what to do next. Eric sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The words from Claire's texts replayed in his mind like a broken record. He won't suspect a thing. What the hell did that even mean? How long had this been going on? And how could Claire, the woman who cried at their wedding vows, look him in the eye every night and pretend everything was fine? For the first time in years, Eric didn't go home right away. Instead, he drove. Past the shops downtown, past the high school where Claire worked, past the diner where they used to grab late-night milkshakes. Eventually, he found himself parked outside Mike's place. Mike answered the door in basketball shorts and a faded band tee, a beer in one hand and a confused look on his face. "Dude, it's almost midnight. What's going on?" Eric didn't bother with small talk. "I need to talk. It's about Claire." That got Mike's attention. He stepped aside, letting Eric in. Over the next hour, Eric spilled everything. The late nights, the defensiveness, the texts. By the time he was done, Mike looked like he wanted to punch someone. "She's cheating on you with some guy from college. That's messed up, man." Eric let out a bitter laugh. "Tell me about it." "So, what now?" That was the million-dollar question. Part of Eric wanted to confront Claire right away, demand answers, and throw her stuff out on the lawn. But another part of him needed to know more. "I need proof," Eric said finally. "Real proof, something she can't talk her way out of." Mike leaned back, arms crossed. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" Eric nodded. "Yeah, I need your help." Mike hesitated, but only for a second. "I'm in." The next day, Eric installed a GPS tracker on Claire's car. It felt wrong, like something out of a bad spy movie, but desperate times called for desperate measures. At first, there was nothing. Claire's routine seemed normal. School, errands, home. But then, on Thursday night, the tracker pinged an unfamiliar address across town. Eric and Mike followed. They parked a block away and waited. "Are we really doing this?" Mike muttered, peering through binoculars. Eric ignored him. His eyes were locked on Claire's car, parked outside a modern-looking apartment complex. A few minutes later, she walked out, hand in hand with Jake. Eric felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. Jake opened the passenger door for her, leaning in close as he whispered something that made her laugh. Mike swore under his breath. "I'll kill him." Eric didn't move. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he kept his voice steady. "Not yet." They waited until Jake drove off, then followed at a distance. The car stopped at a bar downtown. From their spot across the street, Eric and Mike watched as Claire and Jake grabbed drinks, sat in a corner booth, and cozied up like a couple on a date. "Still think it's nothing?" Mike asked. Eric didn't answer. He already knew the truth. The hardest part came later, pretending like he didn't know Claire came home that night with her usual excuses, late meeting, extra prep for finals. Eric played along, but inside, he was unraveling. Over the next few days, the lies piled up. Claire started leaving earlier in the mornings and coming home later at night. Her phone was always on silent, and she guarded it like a hawk. Eric started sleeping on the couch. claiming he didn't want to wake her up when he got home late. In reality, he couldn't stand lying next to her. One night, Mike texted him. "Mike, you're not going to believe this. Check your email." Eric opened the attachment and felt his stomach drop. Photos, clear as day, of Claire and Jake kissing in the parking lot outside his apartment. There was no denying it now. That's when Eric decided it was time to stop waiting and start acting. The next morning he met with a lawyer. He laid everything out: Claire's texts, the tracker data, the photos. By the time he left the office, he had a plan. Later that night, Claire came home to find Eric sitting at the kitchen table, divorce papers spread out in front of him. "What's this?" she asked, her voice tight. Eric didn't look up. "You tell me." Claire froze, her eyes darting to the papers, then back to him. "Eric, don't." He finally met her gaze, and for the first time in weeks, he felt calm. "I know, Claire. About Jake, about the texts, about the lies." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Save it." Eric pushed the papers toward her. "You've already said enough." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "It's not what you think. Stop." Eric's voice was sharp. "I read the messages, I saw the photos. Don't insult me by pretending it's nothing." She sank into a chair, tears spilling over. "I never meant to hurt you." "Funny," Eric said, "because you sure didn't try to stop." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Claire wiped her face and looked at him. "What happens now?" Eric leaned back, crossing his arms. "You sign the papers, you move out, and you leave me the hell alone." She flinched, but didn't argue. By the end of the night, Claire had packed a bag and left. Eric stood in the doorway, watching her go. Part of him wanted to call her back, to beg her to stay, to fix what was broken. But the other part, the stronger part, knew better. He closed the door and locked it. And just like that, their marriage was over. If you've been hooked so far, make sure to hit that like button and drop a comment below. What would you do in Eric's shoes? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. We've got plenty more drama coming your way. Eric thought the worst was behind him after Claire left, but as it turns out, the end of their marriage was just the beginning of a much bigger storm. The first few days after the split felt like a fog. Eric kept his head down at the garage, working overtime to keep his mind off the mess his life had become. Mike stuck around, checking in every day to make sure he didn't completely fall apart. But Eric wasn't broken. He was angry. And that anger only grew when Claire started spreading lies about their breakup. "She's saying I was controlling," Eric muttered, scrolling through her social media posts. "That I didn't support her dreams." Mike leaned over his shoulder. "Yeah, well, you supported her dreams with your overtime checks and home renovations. Don't let her rewrite the story." Easier said than done. Claire had friends, mutual ones even. And it didn't take long for Eric to notice the pitying looks at the grocery store or the whispers behind his back at the diner. But what really pushed him over the edge was Jake. 2 weeks after Claire moved out, Eric spotted Jake driving her car, the one Eric had helped her pick out. The same car he'd fixed after a fender bender last year, without charging her a dime. Mike had to physically hold him back from marching over and ripping Jake out of the driver's seat. "Not here," Mike hissed. "You want to fight this guy? Do it smart, not in the middle of a parking lot." So Eric backed off, but he didn't let it go. Instead, he started digging. It didn't take much to find dirt on Jake. A quick search revealed a bankruptcy filing 2 years earlier and a string of bad debts. But the real bombshell came when Eric reached out to one of Claire's old friends, Megan. "Jake?" Megan scoffed. "He's a joke. Do you know how many women he's gone through? He's a user, Eric. He finds women who'll pay his bills and tell him he's special." Eric's blood boiled. Claire hadn't just left him. She'd fallen for a con artist. And Eric wasn't about to let Jake walk away without consequences. The next step was subtle. He started tracking Jake, his schedule, his habits. Turns out, Jake had a pattern. Every Wednesday, he met with a group of guys at the same upscale bar. Eric waited for the perfect moment. When it came, it wasn't in the form of some dramatic showdown. It was a slow burn. One Wednesday night, Eric walked into that bar, calm and collected, Jake didn't even notice him at first. "Jake, right?" Eric said, loud enough to make the table go quiet. Jake turned, blinking in surprise. "Eric, what are you doing here?" "Oh, just grabbing a drink," Eric replied, smiling like he didn't have a care in the world. "Wanted to see the guy who's been borrowing my wife's car." Jake's friends shifted uncomfortably, and Jake's expression darkened. "Look, man." "No, you look," Eric cut him off, his voice dropping low enough for only Jake to hear. "You think you've won? That you can just take what's mine and get away with it?" Jake swallowed hard. "It's not like that." "Sure it is," Eric said, still smiling. "And that's fine. But you better make damn sure you can afford it, because I'm about to make your life hell." Eric walked out before Jake could respond. By the time he got home, he'd already put the rest of his plan into motion. The first blow hit Jake the next morning when his landlord served him an eviction notice. Turns out Jake had been late on rent for months, and Eric had made sure the building's owner knew it. The second blow came when Eric tipped off Jake's boss about some suspicious side deals Jake had been making. 2 days later, Jake was out of a job, but the knockout punch came when Eric confronted Claire. "You need to talk to your boyfriend," he said, handing her the stack of evidence he'd gathered, "because he's not who you think he is." Claire tried to play it cool, but Eric saw the doubt flicker in her eyes as she skimmed the papers: unpaid debts, shady business deals, and a pattern of leaving women high and dry. "I made a mistake," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Eric said. "You did." But he wasn't done yet. Because while Claire crumbled under the weight of her own decisions, Eric was just getting started. Eric's confrontation with Claire had shattered whatever illusions she had left. But even as she crumbled, Eric knew the war wasn't over. Jake wasn't the type to go down quietly, and Eric wasn't about to let his guard down. Not now. The fallout came faster than he expected. 2 days after Claire's breakdown, Jake showed up at the garage. Eric was in the middle of replacing brake pads when he saw Jake's car pull into the lot. He wiped his hands and stepped outside, already bracing for trouble. "Really, Eric?" Jake sneered, stepping out of the car. "You think you can mess with my life and just walk away?" Eric leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "I think you've done a pretty good job messing up your own life." Jake took a step closer, his voice dropping. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Digging up dirt, making calls. But guess what? Claire's still talking to me. She's scared. She doesn't trust you anymore." For a split second, Eric's stomach twisted, but he didn't let it show. "Is that so?" he said coolly. "Because last I checked, she was too busy figuring out where to live now that you're broke and unemployed." Jake's face darkened. "You don't scare me." Eric took a step forward. "Good," he said, "because I'm not trying to scare you. I'm warning you, stay away from me, stay away from Claire. And if I hear so much as a whisper about you messing with my business, I'll bury you." Jake flinched, but covered it with a smirk. "We'll see about that." He stormed off, tires screeching as he sped out of the lot. Mike came out a minute later. "You good?" Eric exhaled slowly. "Yeah, but this isn't over." And it wasn't. The next day, Eric found his truck's tires slashed. The following week, a call came from the city inspector about an anonymous complaint regarding zoning violations at the garage. Eric knew exactly who was behind it, but instead of lashing out, he did what he did best. He got to work. While Mike helped him fix the truck, Eric made phone calls, gathering statements from other mechanics and business owners who dealt with Jake's shady behavior. He filed police reports, documented every incident, and even installed security cameras around the shop. It didn't take long for Jake's reputation to catch up with him. One by one, his former employers and business contacts started coming forward, sharing stories of unpaid debts and fraud. Eric compiled everything and sent it straight to Jake's landlord, who promptly evicted him. Claire, meanwhile, tried to keep her distance, but Eric could see the cracks forming. She showed up at the garage one afternoon, looking like she hadn't slept in days. "I need your help," she said, her voice shaking. Eric raised an eyebrow. "With what?" "It's Jake. He's out of control. He's been threatening me, showing up at my place, demanding money." Eric crossed his arms. "You sure you don't want to ask your soulmate for help?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "I made a mistake. Okay, I know that now. I didn't think it would end like this." Eric wanted to feel sorry for her. He really did. But after everything she'd put him through, he wasn't ready to forgive her. "You need to go to the police," he said flatly. Claire nodded, wiping her face. "Will you come with me?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Let's go." The next few hours were a blur. They filed a restraining order, handed over the evidence Eric had collected, and made sure Jake's name was flagged in the system. But the real turning point came later that night. Eric was locking up the garage when he saw headlights pull into the lot. It was Jake. This time, though, he wasn't alone. Two other men climbed out of the car, and Eric immediately knew this wasn't just another scare tactic. He reached for his phone, but one of the men pulled out a tire iron. Eric stood his ground. "You really want to do this?" Jake smirked. "You should have stayed out of it, Eric. Now you're going to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong guy." Before Eric could respond, the first man lunged. What followed was a blur of fists, metal, and adrenaline. Eric fought back with everything he had, but the numbers weren't on his side. Just when it looked like things were about to take a turn for the worst, headlights flooded the lot. Mike. He came barreling out of his truck with a crowbar, yelling loud enough to wake the neighborhood. The men scattered, but not before Mike managed to clip Jake's car with his truck as they sped off. "You okay?" Mike panted, helping Eric to his feet. Eric winced, wiping blood from his lip. "I've been better." They called the cops, and this time, with the restraining order in place, Jake didn't get off easy. He was arrested the next morning for violating the order, and the police found enough evidence to tie him to the vandalism and threats. As for Claire, she moved back in with her parents, finally cutting ties with Jake for good. Eric didn't take her back, not after everything she'd done. But he didn't hate her either, because in the end, her betrayal had taught him something important, about trust, about resilience, and about standing up for himself. The next few weeks were tough, but slowly, Eric started rebuilding. And this time, he wasn't doing it for anyone else. If you've made it this far, let us know your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Eric's situation? And don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more stories like this one. Eric's bruises were still fresh, but his resolve was sharper than ever. Jake's arrest had bought him some breathing room, but deep down, Eric knew it wasn't over. Jake wasn't the kind of guy to stay down for long, and sure enough, it only took 2 days for him to post bail. Mike called as soon as he heard the news. "You need to be careful," he warned. "Guys like Jake don't let things go. He's going to come back swinging." Eric didn't doubt it, but this time, he was ready. He reinforced the security cameras at the shop, replaced the locks, and even had Mike stay over a few nights, just in case Jake tried anything. But Jake didn't come after him right away. Instead, he went after Claire. Eric got the call late one night. "It's him!" Claire's voice shook on the other end. "He's outside my parents' house. He's been banging on the door for 10 minutes. What do I do?" "Call the police," Eric said, already grabbing his keys. "I'm on my way." By the time Eric got there, the cops were already cuffing Jake and shoving him into the back of a squad car. Claire stood on the porch, shaking, while her dad yelled at the officers to keep him locked up this time. When Claire saw Eric, her face crumpled. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Eric didn't know what to say. He wanted to be angry, wanted to remind her that this mess was her fault, but seeing her like that, terrified and broken, made it impossible. "It's gonna be okay," he said, even though he wasn't sure it was true. Later that night, Claire called him again. "I can't stay here," she said. "Not after this. He knows where my parents live. He's not going to stop." Eric leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. "You should leave town for a while. Go stay with your aunt or someone." "What about you?" "I'll be fine," he said. But he wasn't fine. Over the next few days, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that Jake wasn't finished. Then, late one night, the shop's alarm went off. Eric was there within minutes, but by the time he arrived, the damage was already done. Windows shattered. Tools scattered, oil poured across the floor like a crime scene. The security footage showed Jake and 2 other guys smashing everything they could before taking off. Eric's hands shook as he watched the replay. He'd expected this, but seeing it play out in real time hit harder than he thought it would. Mike showed up a few minutes later and let out a long whistle. "Damn, he really went for it." Eric nodded, jaw tight. "This ends tonight." They called the cops, but Eric didn't stop there. He pulled out his phone and started making calls, first to Jake's old landlord, then to his former boss, then to the guy who repossessed his car last year. By the time Eric was done, Jake's entire past was laid bare, and the cops had more than enough to keep him locked up this time. But Eric didn't stop there. He reached out to Claire, making sure she had enough evidence to file for a restraining order and press charges of her own. By the time Jake finally stood in court, he was facing a laundry list of charges: vandalism, harassment, assault, and violating his previous restraining order. The judge didn't go easy on him. Jake was sentenced to 2 years in prison, with no chance of early release. When the verdict came down, Claire broke down in tears. Eric felt relieved, not happy. There was nothing happy about any of this, but relieved that it was finally over. But even as the dust settled, Eric knew this wasn't just about Jake. It was about rebuilding his life, his business, and his sense of trust. He started small, cleaning up the garage, replacing the tools and parts that were damaged, slowly piecing things back together, one day at a time. And Claire. She took a job in another city, far away from the mess she'd made. They didn't stay in touch, but Eric didn't need closure. He already had it. Because when he looked around the shop, when he saw the new security cameras, the reinforced locks, and the steady flow of customers, he knew he'd built something stronger than before, something that no one, not Jake, not Claire, not anyone, could tear down. If you've been following Eric's story, let us know what you think in the comments. Could you forgive Claire? What would you have done in Eric's shoes? Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss more stories like this one. Eric's relief after Jake's sentencing was short-lived. The damage Jake had left behind wasn't just physical, it was emotional. And even though the shop was repaired, Eric still carried the weight of everything that had happened. He'd rebuilt his business, but trust that was harder to fix. For weeks, he threw himself into work, taking extra shifts and bigger jobs just to stay busy, Mike noticed. "Man, you can't keep running yourself into the ground like this," Mike said one night after closing. Eric didn't look up from the engine he was working on. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." Mike grabbed a stool and sat down. "Look, I get it. Claire messed you up. Jake took things to another level. But it's over now. You can let it go." Eric wiped his hands on a rag and finally met Mike's eyes. "You don't get it. They didn't just mess up my life. They made me question everything. Claire was supposed to be my partner. Jake was nothing, and he almost destroyed everything I built. How do you just let that go?" Mike leaned back. "You don't, but you don't let it own you either." Eric wanted to believe that he really did, but the anger, the betrayal, still burned. Then, just when he thought he could start moving forward, Claire called. "Oh." Eric almost didn't answer, but curiosity, or maybe habit, got the better of him. "What do you want, Claire?" Her voice was shaky. "I need to see you." Eric's jaw tightened. "We have nothing left to talk about. Please, it's important." Against his better judgment, he agreed. They met at the same diner where they used to grab late-night pancakes, but this time there was no laughter. No easy conversation, just tension. Claire looked worse than the last time he'd seen her. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes puffy like she hadn't slept in days. "I didn't know who else to call," she said, stirring her coffee without drinking it. "That's not my problem anymore." "Eric, please just listen." He crossed his arms and waited. "It's Jake." Her voice broke. "He's been writing me letters from prison, threatening me, saying I ruined his life and that he'll fix it when he gets out." Eric froze. "When does he get out?" "Soon," she whispered. "And I'm scared." Eric felt the anger bubbling up again. After everything Claire had done, after all the pain she caused, she still expected him to save her. But despite himself, he couldn't ignore the fear in her eyes. "What do you want me to do, Claire?" "I don't know, She wiped her face, struggling to hold it together. "I just need to know he won't come after me again." Eric leaned back and let out a long breath. "Fine, I'll make sure he doesn't." And just like that, Eric was dragged back into the mess he thought he'd escaped. The first thing he did was call his lawyer. He wanted to make sure the restraining order was still in place and get updates on Jake's status. It turned out Jake's sentence had been reduced for good behavior, and he was set to be released in less than 2 weeks. Eric didn't wait. He started documenting everything. Claire's calls, the letters, even the threats Jake had made before his arrest. Then, he went to the police. But the officers didn't give him the answer he was hoping for. "We'll keep an eye out," one officer said. "But unless he violates the restraining order again, there's not much we can do." Eric left the station more frustrated than ever. Mike tried to talk him down. "Look, man, he's not going to risk going back to jail. Guys like him talk big, but once they're out, they move on." But Eric wasn't so sure. The night before Jake's release, Eric couldn't sleep. He sat in the garage, staring at the security monitors, waiting for something, anything, to happen. It didn't. Jake was released the next morning, and for a few days, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Then, Claire's car was vandalized, tires slashed, windows broken. A note taped to the windshield read, "You can't hide forever." Eric saw red. He drove straight to Jake's last known address, half expecting to find him waiting. But Jake wasn't there. Instead, Eric found one of Jake's old friends, a guy who owed Eric a favor. "Look, man," the guy said, looking nervous. "Jake's been talking a lot. Says he's not done with you or Claire. Says he's going to make you pay." That was all Eric needed to hear. By the time Eric got back to the shop, Mike was already there, waiting. "What's the plan?" Mike asked, seeing the fire in Eric's eyes. "We end this." Eric called the cops again, this time demanding extra patrols near the garage and Claire's parents' house. Then, he installed even more cameras, making sure every angle was covered. But he didn't stop there. He set up motion detectors, reinforced the locks, and kept a crowbar by the door, just in case. The waiting was the hardest part. Every night, Eric stayed up, expecting Jake to show up. And then, one night, he did. It was almost 2 a.m. when the alarms went off. Eric grabbed the crowbar and ran outside, heart pounding. Jake was there, smashing the windows of Eric's truck. "Jake!" Eric yelled, charging forward. Jake turned, eyes wild. "You think you can ruin my life and get away with it?" Eric didn't answer. He swung the crowbar, forcing Jake to back up. "You ruined your own life," Eric said, his voice low and steady. "Now get the hell off my property." Jake lunged, but Eric was ready. He knocked the crowbar against Jake's arm, sending him stumbling back. By the time the cops showed up, Jake was on the ground, handcuffed and yelling about how this wasn't over. But for Eric, it was over. Watching the cops haul Jake away, Eric felt the weight finally lift. It had taken months, but he'd fought back. He'd protected himself, his business, and even Claire, even if she didn't deserve it. Now, he was free to move on. And this time, nothing would stop him. If you're still with us, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Eric's shoes? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. Eric stood in the cold night air, watching as the cops drove away with Jake in the back seat. The flashing red and blue lights faded into the distance, but Eric's pulse still pounded in his ears. Mike clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, man. He's gone." Eric exhaled, but the tension in his chest didn't fully release. For now. The adrenaline that had kept him sharp was wearing off, leaving behind exhaustion and the dull ache of bruises he hadn't even noticed during the fight. But there was no time to rest. Not yet. Inside the garage, Eric reviewed the security footage. He needed to make sure Jake hadn't left any surprises behind. The cameras had captured everything, from Jake breaking the truck windows to Eric fighting him off. It was enough evidence to make sure Jake wouldn't talk his way out of this one. Still, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The next morning, Claire called. "Is he really gone?" she asked, her voice trembling. "For now," Eric replied. "The cops took him in, and this time they've got more than enough to keep him there." "I don't know what I'd do without you," she said softly. Eric's stomach tightened. He knew what she was trying to do, pull him back in, lean on him like she always had. But this time, he wasn't biting. "You'll figure it out," he said, keeping his tone neutral. There was a long pause. "Eric, I'm sorry for everything." He didn't answer right away. A few months ago, those words might have meant something, but now? "Take care of yourself, Claire." And then he hung up. For the first time since everything started, Eric felt like he was finally free. But freedom didn't mean forgetting. Over the next week, Eric focused on rebuilding, literally and figuratively. The garage got new locks, new cameras, and even a new sign. He and Mike worked overtime to make up for the repairs and lost business. And by the end of the month, the shop was busier than ever. Word about Jake's arrest had spread fast, and instead of hurting Eric's reputation, it seemed to boost it. Customers respected the way he'd handled the situation, and how he'd stood his ground. But even with things looking up, Eric couldn't let his guard down. Jake's trial was set for the following month, and Eric planned to be there for every minute of it. When the day finally came, Eric walked into the courthouse, feeling a strange mix of nerves and determination. Claire was already there, sitting in the front row with her parents. She looked small and pale, but Eric didn't go to her. He didn't need to. The trial started with the prosecution laying out Jake's pattern of harassment and violence, the vandalism, the threats, the letters. And then came the footage, clear as day, showing Jake smashing Eric's truck and attacking him with a tire iron. Jake's lawyer tried to spin it, claiming it was a misunderstanding fueled by jealousy, but the evidence was too overwhelming. When Claire took the stand, her voice shook, but she held firm. "He told me he loved me," she said, "that we were meant to be together, but it was all lies. He used me, manipulated me, and when I tried to leave, he threatened me." Eric felt a flicker of sympathy, but it faded quickly. Claire might have been a victim too, but that didn't excuse what she'd done. The turning point came when the judge read the verdict. Guilty on all charges. Jake's expression didn't change, but Eric saw the flash of panic in his eyes as the guards led him out. It was over. After the trial, Claire tried to catch up with Eric outside the courthouse. "Can we talk?" Eric shook his head. "There's nothing left to say, Claire." "Eric, please." "No," he said firmly. "You made your choices, now I'm making mine." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing on the courthouse steps. And just like that, the chapter was closed. But Eric didn't stop moving forward. He threw himself into work, expanding the garage and even hiring 2 new mechanics to keep up with the demand. He started volunteering at the local vocational school, teaching auto repair classes to kids who reminded him of himself. Scrappy, determined, and ready to prove everyone wrong. And for the first time in a long time, Eric felt proud, not just of what he'd built, but of who he'd become. When Mike asked him one day if he was ready to start dating again, Eric laughed. "Maybe," he said, "but not yet." Because for now, Eric was focused on one thing, himself. And after everything he'd been through, he knew that was more than enough. If you've made it this far, let us know in the comments. What would you have done in Eric's shoes? And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this one. Eric stood outside the garage, watching the last streaks of daylight fade into the horizon. The hum of passing cars and distant voices barely registered. His mind was still stuck in the courtroom, replaying every moment. Jake was gone, locked up for good this time, but the echoes of the chaos he'd left behind still lingered. Eric had fought hard to reclaim his life, and he wasn't about to let his guard down now. But just when he thought the worst was behind him, reality had other plans. It started with a phone call. "Eric?" Claire's voice was thin, almost brittle. "What now?" he asked, already bracing for more drama. "There's something you need to know. Unless it's about Jake, I don't want to hear it." "It is about Jake." She hesitated. "I got another letter." Eric's grip on the phone tightened. "What?" "It was postmarked before the trial. He must have sent it before he was sentenced, Eric. It's bad." He didn't want to care, didn't want to let Claire drag him back into her mess, but the fear in her voice stopped him. "Read it," he said. Her breath hitched. It said, "You think this is over, but it's not. I have friends, Claire, people who owe me favors. Enjoy your freedom while it lasts." Eric's heart sank. "You need to give that letter to the cops," he said firmly. "I did, but they said without new evidence, there's not much they can do. What if he meant it? What if he told someone to come after us?" Eric wanted to tell her she was overreacting, but he couldn't. Not after everything Jake had already done. Instead, he said, "Don't worry, I'll handle it." And just like that, Eric was back in fight mode. The first thing he did was upgrade security. Again, new cameras, reinforced locks, even floodlights for the parking lot. But he didn't stop there. He called in a favor from an old friend, a retired cop named Ray. "Keep an eye out," Eric told him. "Anything suspicious? I want to know." Ray didn't ask questions. He just nodded. Days passed, and nothing happened. But Eric couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Then, late one night, the motion detectors went off. Eric bolted out of bed, grabbing the baseball bat he kept by the door. Outside, the parking lot was empty, but the side door to the garage was wide open. He stepped inside slowly, every muscle tensed. "Who's there?" he called out. Silence. Then, a creak. Eric spun, raising the bat just as a shadow moved behind the shelves. "Show yourself!" The figure stepped into the light, and Eric's stomach dropped. It wasn't Jake. It was one of Jake's old buddies, the same guy Eric had seen hanging around him before the arrest. "Put the bat down," the man said, smirking. "Not a chance." The guy took a step closer. "Jake says hello." Eric didn't hesitate. He swung the bat, catching the guy in the shoulder and knocking him back into the shelves. Tools clattered to the floor, but Eric didn't stop. He shoved the guy against the wall, pinning him. "You tell Jake he made a mistake," Eric growled. "And if you or anyone else comes near me or Claire again, I'll make sure you regret it." The guy shoved him off and bolted, disappearing into the night. Eric called the cops, but by the time they arrived, the guy was long gone. The officer took his statement, but Eric could see it in his eyes. They thought it was just a one-time scare. Eric knew better. The next morning he called Claire. "You need to leave town," he said. "What, why?" "Because this isn't over. Jake's still pulling strings, and I won't let him get to you." Claire's voice wavered. "Where would I even go?" "I'll figure something out, just pack a bag." For the next 2 days, Eric barely slept. He split his time between the shop and watching Claire's parents' house, making sure no one got near her. Then, the next break came. Ray called. "I've been tracking Jake's crew. Found out that guy you saw. He's been hanging around an abandoned warehouse on the east side." Eric didn't even hesitate. "Send me the address." "Eric, don't do anything stupid." But Eric was done waiting. When he pulled up to the warehouse later that night, his stomach churned. The place was dark, except for a faint light coming from inside. Eric grabbed his crowbar and stepped through the rusted door. The man from the garage was there, along with 2 others. "Well, well," the man said, grinning. "Look who showed up." Eric didn't waste time. He charged, knocking over the nearest guy and swinging the crowbar at the second. The fight was fast and brutal. Eric took a few hits, but gave back twice as many. By the time the cops arrived, thanks to Ray's tip, 2 of the men were unconscious, and the third was handcuffed. Eric stood there, breathing hard, as the officers took over. This time, there were no warnings, no bail. Jake's crew was officially out of the picture. Eric drove home that night, with a split lip and bruised knuckles, but for the first time in months, he felt like he could finally breathe. The next morning, Claire called. "I'm safe," she said. "I'm staying with my aunt for now." "Good," Eric said. And that was the last time they spoke. Eric didn't need closure. He didn't need apologies. He just needed to move forward. And this time, nothing was holding him back. If you're still here, let us know what you thought of Eric's story in the comments. Would you have handled things the same way? Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more intense stories like this one. The weeks after the warehouse showdown felt different for Eric. For the first time in months, there were no alarms, no late-night phone calls, and no shadows lurking outside his shop. The chaos was over. Jake's crew had been taken down, and with the evidence piled against them, including their ties to Jake's threats, they weren't getting out anytime soon. But the real victory wasn't in the arrests. It was in the quiet. Eric finally had the peace he'd been fighting for. The garage was busier than ever, thanks to the local buzz about his story. Customers saw him as someone who stood his ground, who didn't let people push him around. And for the first time in a long time, Eric felt proud of himself, not just for what he'd built, but for how he'd defended it. Mike was still around too, more like a brother than just a coworker. One afternoon, Mike leaned against the garage door, watching Eric work. "So," he said, "what's next?" Eric shrugged, tightening a bolt on a customer's truck. "I don't know, maybe a vacation, or I could finally finish that project car in the back." Mike grinned. Or maybe you could stop avoiding the waitress at the diner who keeps asking about you. Eric rolled his eyes but didn't deny it. The truth was, he'd started to feel ready to move on, ready to let someone new into his life. But this time, he wasn't in any rush. One evening, Eric stood in the garage alone, staring at the old Mustang he'd been restoring for years. It had been Claire's dream car, the one they used to talk about fixing up together. But now, it just felt like another reminder of the past. So he sold it. And in its place, he bought something new, something completely different. A project that was all his, with no strings attached. It was more than just a car, it was a fresh start. Meanwhile, Claire stayed out of his life. She sent one last text, thanking him for helping her and apologizing again for the way things ended. Eric didn't respond. Not because he was angry. He wasn't anymore, but because he'd already let go. Claire had been a part of his life, and that part was over. He wished her well, but he wasn't looking back. Instead, Eric focused on what was ahead. He expanded the shop, hired another mechanic, and even started offering night classes at the local trade school. Teaching wasn't something he'd ever thought about before, but seeing his students' excitement reminded him why he'd fallen in love with fixing cars in the first place. And little by little, the scars left behind by Jake and Claire started to fade. One Saturday afternoon, Eric was closing up the shop when Mike pulled up in his truck. "Come on," Mike said. "We're celebrating." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Celebrating what?" Mike grinned. "You surviving all this crap and coming out on top." Eric laughed but let Mike drag him out anyway. They ended up at the diner, the same one where Eric had met Claire for the first time, and where so many conversations had turned into arguments. But this time, it didn't feel heavy. Instead, it felt like a full-circle moment, like he was closing a door he'd been afraid to shut for too long. And when the waitress Mike had mentioned earlier stopped by with a smile, Eric smiled back. Maybe this was his second chance. Later that night, Eric drove home with the windows down, the cool air filling the cab of his truck. For the first time in months, he didn't feel weighed down. He wasn't looking over his shoulder anymore. And as he pulled into his driveway and shut off the engine, he let himself feel it. Peace. Because no matter how messy things had gotten, he'd come out stronger. He'd fought back, rebuilt his life, and learned how to trust himself again. And now, he was ready for whatever came next. So, what do you guys think? Did Eric handle things the right way? Could you have walked away from Claire like he did? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.